Hello, everyone, and welcome. I greet you from Washington, D.C. I am Armando El-Khouri, and these are Robert Kitchen, the co-organizer of the Year of Jacob of Sarug, Philip Fornes, and Jeffrey Wicks. Jeffrey is today's speaker. We are glad that so many of you are able to join us on Zoom today to celebrate Jacob. We also greet and welcome our viewers on the Eparchal YouTube channel and on Urho the Way. Before I pass the mic to Robert, who will give homage to Mary Hansberry and Martine Parmentier, who have recently passed away, I want to thank our guest speaker, Jeffrey Wicks, for his paper, The Living Saints in Jacob's Memre, and His Excellency Elias Zaidan for sponsoring this online conference. I also want to share with you the logistics of managing this talk. You have already noticed that you are muted. You cannot unmute yourselves unless I request that you do so. You may direct your questions to today's speaker only at the end of his talk. First, you need to raise your virtual hand. To do so, click on the reactions icon under the video feed. When the small pop-up window opens up, click on Raise Hand, and I will call on you in the order I see on my screen. And I will request that you unmute yourself. Once unmuted, you may ask your question. Thank you again for joining us. And here's Robert Kitchen.
As a community of people who are engaged in Syriac studies, we wish to acknowledge the passing in the past several weeks of two of our colleagues and friends. Mary Hansberry of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was a prolific translator of Syriac texts, particularly mystical writers, John of Dalyatha, John the Solitary, Isaac of Nineveh, and indeed of Jacob of Sarug. She was also an accomplished iconographer, and her depictions of Syriac authors grace many of the covers of our publications of Syriac texts. Martine Parmentier of Hilversum, the Netherlands, indeed has an important part in my life and career in Syriac. He was my co-author in the translation of the Book of Steps many years ago, and indeed is the person who really pushed and initiated me into the field. He taught church history at seminaries in the Netherlands, and also taught at the University of Basel in Switzerland. His understanding of the theology of Syriac was one that really pushed me as well and opened up a new world. We shall deeply miss both of them as scholars and indeed as companions along the way. At this time, I'd like to turn our microphone over to Philip Fornes, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Bob, for that tribute to our colleagues. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Wicks today as our speaker. Professor Wicks is currently Associate Professor of Early Christianity at St. Louis University. He's perhaps best known for his work on Ephraim the Syrian, and especially his very vivid translation of the Hymns on Faith that appeared in 2015, as well as his study of the same set of hymns in a monograph entitled Bible and Poetry in Late Antique Mesopotamia, which appeared in 2019. In these works, Professor Wicks developed a new approach to contextualizing Ephraim hymns by placing them within a pedagogical setting, with Ephraim functioning as the teacher. Wicks also offers a distinct perspective on Ephraim's thought world by demonstrating how Ephraim's language, which is saturated, permeated with biblical allusions, situates himself, his audience, and the theological controversies of his day within the biblical text. Currently, Professor Wicks is working on a large project on the poetry on the saints in the late antique Syriac tradition, juxtaposing the hagiographical works of authors such as Ephraim, Isaac of Antioch, Narsai, and of course, Jacob of Sarug. We're very fortunate today to be able to glimpse Professor's work's approach to the hagiographical poetry of Jacob in his talk entitled The Living Saints in Jacob's Memre.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks, Bob, for the moving tribute. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Your Excellencies, teachers, colleagues, and friends, it's a joy to be with you. I'm humbled to share some of my work with you and to hope that we can learn together. Of the vast corpus of Memre that survived by Jacob of Sarug, around 30 relate to the saints, biblical and post-biblical. Like a lot of Jacob's corpus, this poetry remains to a large extent unexplored, and for various reasons. For social historians, the hagiographical poems, unlike prose hagiographies, rarely contain the kind of data that reveal the everyday, at least in an explicit sense, though perhaps Professor Debier's talk next month will suggest another way of thinking through this. For scholars of prose hagiographical literature, the hagiographical poetry can appear derivative. In most cases, Jacob is neither our first nor our only source for a hagiographical legend. Rather than granting us insight into the origins of a cult, Jacob speaks to us right from its midst, stylizing himself unapologetically as a devotee. I should also add the practical limitation that until very recently, there were a lot of these poems that we did not have easy access to that we do now because of the outstanding work of Father Achras. However, for the scholar of late antique poetry, Syriac and otherwise, Jacob's corpus of hagiographical poems stands as one of the largest early corpora of hagiographical poetry, paralleled perhaps only by Prudentius in Latin, and grants us unique insights into late antique poetry writ large. While the literary form of the hagiographical Memre does not differ from the forms Jacob utilized elsewhere, their relationship to literary networks, festal contexts, and to the particular religious questions triggered by the saints is unique. As a piece of a larger exploration of Syriac hagiographical poetry, this talk thinks through the vibrancy of the saints in Jacob's poetry in connection with the vibrancy of the poetry itself. In using the word vibrancy, I mean to evoke the non-metaphoric sense of movement that the word conveys, and to suggest that both saints and poems are for Jacob living, moving actors. In the context of the feast, the poems consecrate the saints, but the saints also consecrate the poems. Both of these movements derive ultimately from God, but that divine act is negotiated through actors both human and non-human. This paper explores these questions in 3 parts. In the first part, I examine the various ways in which Jacob denotes the vibrancy of the saint in his poems. In the second part, I shift to the form of the poems. Building on the work of Manolis Papoutsakis and Susan Harvey, I explore the formulaic structure of the proemia in the hagiographical poems, and suggest that we can think of these formulaic proemia in ritual terms. In the third part, I circle back to this question of vibrancy. I build on Bob Kitchen's work on the Memre and Sharba as actors in Jacob's poetry, and try to show the place of the saints in this complex assemblage of agencies. The saints, like God, Memre, and Sharba, act on Jacob and bring his poetic self into being. The poem represents a ritual registering of this act of passivity, even as it actively reassembles these agents anew. So part 1, Saints That Live. In Father Achras's new edition of Jacob's poetry, there is a poem on a saint named Abhai. The poem is not, as far as I can tell, actually attributed to Jacob, but it's in Jacob's meter, travels in manuscripts alongside his poetry, and in terms of content and meter, sounds very much like a poem by Jacob. Narratively, the poem is made up of two tangentially related parts. One having to do with Saint Abhai, a saint who lived in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, but about whom the poet appears to know very little in the way of biographical detail, and one having to do with a collection of relics residing in the palace of the Emperor Theodosius. The narrative surrounding Abhai, with which the poem begins and ends, is not especially remarkable, consisting in a series of pious generalities and a couple of stock wonder-working topoi. The narrative surrounding the relics, which sits at the poem's center, is very remarkable for reasons that sit at the heart of this talk. The relics profile in this poem as the clearest example of what seems to be true throughout Jacob's hagiographical poetry. The saints manifest in the form of their relics live. They move, they pray, they summon the poet to sing in their honor, and generally act as a vibrant and not always welcome force in the world. The center narrative in this poem on Abhai breaks down into 4 micro-narrative scenes, told in a neat sequence, in which the bones, never identified with any particular saint, repeatedly act in the world in anthropomorphic ways. In the first scene, Theodosius decides to test the authenticity of a large collection of relics that reside in the imperial palace. The poem does not explain where they have come from or why Theodosius doubts their authenticity. Like the 3 youths from the book of Daniel, Theodosius places them all in a fiery kiln, assuming that the legitimate relics will be miraculously kept from destruction. Not only do the true relics meet this challenge, but they actively resist the fire. As the poet narrates it, they wrestled with the flame and flew forth from it. In the second narrative scene, Theodosius, having now been assured of the relic's authenticity, builds for them a luxurious sarcophagus, an adono, made of gold and decorated with fine paintings and ornate pearls. Here again, the relics exert their agency. The poet tells us that the relics hated the world and its pleasures and did not submit to accept the glory of the luxurious reliquary. Just as from the fire, they flew away from the exquisite shrine. Theodosius then builds for them a simple marble reliquary where they reside contentedly. In the third narrative scene, the Lord tells Theodosius to seek out Abhai to care for the reliquary. Theodosius obediently travels to find Abhai. His geographic location is not specified beyond saying that he lives in a cave, and tells him that the bones of the righteous are seeking him. Abhai then goes to the imperial city, where he serves before the relics, Shamesh, night and day. Finally, in the fourth narrative scene, Theodosius has arrived at death's door and asks Abhai to come and prayerfully send him on his way. Abhai comes, and having blessed the emperor, asks to return from whence he came with the relics, the treasury of life, as companions. Theodosius at first resists, informing Abhai that the imperial city will surely fall without the defense the relics provide. Eventually, though, he relents and admits to Abhai that it is the will of the relics, the Sevyon Hon, to leave the city with Abhai. In 4 ways, then, the nameless, non-personalized collective of relics demonstrate an individual human-like agency. They flee from the fire, flee from the ornate reliquary, seek Abhai to come serve before them in Constantinople, and then express their will to leave with him after Theodosius dies. Once they travel with Abhai to an unnamed desert, they more or less disappear from the narrative. This narrative, buried in a poem sung in praise of Abhai, is the clearest example in Jacob's poetry in which the saint's bones exhibit an unqualified vibrancy in the world. In less dramatic ways, that vibrancy nevertheless pulses through the hagiographical poems. In Jacob's poem on Sergius and Bacchus, for example, Jacob declares the bones of Sergius a legion of warriors that guard the region, presumably of Mesopotamia, from harm. In the dust of the bones of the righteous, he sings, God dwells. His power has been joined to the dust of his servants. Because God dwells in these bones, Jacob exhorts his audience to call out to them, for they have the power to conquer death. Similarly, in Jacob's poem on Demet, he praises the saint from whose limbs miracles flow. Behold, he sings, your house is crowded and full of the sick and paralytic, so that everyone might take medicine from your limbs. Jacob declares blessed the place where a portion of your limbs reside. Blessed too, he sings, is the one who ministers before you with holiness and honors your bones as a treasury full of life. In the poem on Abhai, the poet relates a narrative in which the bones move throughout the world with startling ease. Elsewhere in Jacob's poetry, he trains his audience to see in the bones images of God's presence even in death, and to find in the bones agents of miraculous healing. With this idea in mind, the idea that, for Jacob, the saints' vibrancy is manifest in their bones, and therein exert a quasi-independent agency in the world, I want to shift now to ask, how do the bones come to live? Or more precisely, what is the relationship between the forms of Jacob's poetry and the sense of vibrancy attributed to the saints in that poetry? Part 2, form and ritual. There's been something of a turn to form, both the macro form of the Memre as a whole and the micro form of its couplets and smaller subsections in studies of Jacob. In trying to understand the form of Jacob's Memre, outside the very concrete unit of the couplet, the often lengthy proemia provide the most clearly defined structural component. While the body of the poems often move in a variety of directions, the elements of the proemia, the introductory prayers, are attested pretty reliably. Building on the work of Susan Harvey, who has recognized in the proemia a ritual element, a sense in which the proemia to some extent bring the poem to life as an entity distinct from the poet who delivers it, I want now to link the vibrancy of the saints with the ritual elements of the proemium. I will turn in the following section to another angle from which we can observe the vibrancies out of which Jacob's poetry arises. The form, though, provides the linchpin that triggers this sense of Jacob's poetry as living assemblage. Here I look at the proemium's form from two angles. First, giving examples of the component parts of the proemium, and then looking at how these component parts sit comparatively in the proemia of four particular poems. These four poems, which I'll get to in just a moment, are the Memre on the 40 Martyrs of Sebastia, the Memre on Peter's conversion of Rome, the Memre on Lawrence and Agrippa, and the Memre on Julian Saba. Together, these four poems exemplify the coherence of the proemian structure while also indicating its flexibility. But before getting to these four poems, I want to suggest a certain theoretical formulaic character that we can abstract from them, and to show how these structural elements are attested in other hagiographical poems. In theory, the proemium in the hagiographical Memre is built of 5 parts. First, an apostrophe to an invocation of Christ. 2, an expression of poetic incapacity. 3, an expression of the glory of God or saint, and 2 and 3 are typically linked. 4, the saint's invitation of the poem, and 5, an address to the audience. The first category is highly formulaic. I would say that it's the most formulaic in both structure and in language. We can see an example of this in Jacob's poem on St. George. So this is the first two lines of that poem. O good one, who desired to magnify his servants because of his love, magnify my mind to speak about their beauties. And of course, if you've read Jacob's poetry much at all, you will immediately recognize the formulaic character of this opening. As I'll show in a moment, this first characteristic, apostrophe and invocation, is by far the most stable. It appears in almost all of the hagiographical poems, typically appears in the very first lines of the poems, and draws on a fairly stable lexicon, though it's not entirely without variety. The second and the third characteristics travel together. The second is an expression of poetic incapacity, and the third an expression of the glory of God or saint. Here's an example from Jacob's poem on Habib. Who will presume to enter and look into the flame, that is the flame in which Habib resides, but also that he will see the three youths from Daniel within. To whom can Habib be compared? How shall he be depicted among the victorious? Here, the reference to the poet's incapacity is understated. There's not a strong first-person declaration, but is nevertheless implicit in his rhetorical question. Who will presume? The poet himself presumably cannot presume to do such a thing. This is then coupled with the incomparable character of the saint, so the two are linked. As a fourth characteristic, the proemia to the hagiographical Memre almost always indicate that the poem has been invited or summoned by the saint. This notice is typically very short, but can become quite developed. For example, in Jacob's poem on the Maccabees, there is a developed dramatic scene in which the martyrs demand a poem of Jacob. Shmuni, her sons, and the shining elder Eleazar have demanded of me a poem, speaking as though to shame me. In this one, the martyrs go on to complain in a first-person speech that while Jacob has written poems for the post-Christian martyrs, he has completely neglected these martyrs who were forerunners of Christ and who also died out of love for Christ. A fifth characteristic is Jacob's explicit turn to the audience. This one is not quite as commonly attested, but it is enough to note it. And here's an example from Jacob's poem on St. Simeon the Stylite. Come you who hear, suck the sweetness from this teaching. Come take pleasure in the story of the one beautiful man, whose history is more exalted than the waves of the great sea. These are the 5 elements that I would take to be characteristic of the form of the proemia: apostrophe, incapacity, all, summoning, and a turn to the audience. With these 5 characteristics in mind, I want to look now across a series of 4 Memre to see how they're consistently attested, but also flexibly applied. So I'm going to bring up a slide that has a lot of text on it, and I'm actually going to not talk for 30 seconds to let you look over this. So I'm not trying to talk while you're also trying to process all this text. Okay. In displaying the structures in this way, I want to drive home the point of how stable the structure of the proemium is, but also how its elements are distributed flexibly in different poems. At the risk of being patronizing, I'm just going to walk us through these, moving from left to right, which I realize is not appropriate to the audience, but we'll let English dictate our movement for the time being. So starting on the left with the Memre on the 40 martyrs, the 5 characteristics are attested and in the order that I've listed them at the top of the chart. One exception here is that the poet does not tell us that the saints have invited the poem, but in place of that, he does express a desire for the saints to intercede on his behalf. Also note the length of this first proemium. It's 44 lines long, which seems to me pretty typical. Moving to the right, to the Memre on Peter's conversion of Rome, we have some of the same basic characteristics, but housed in a proemium that is much longer, 116 lines, and it is much more flexible in the way the parts are ordered. So we do have first the apostrophe and the invocation. Then we have an expression of the poet's incapacity, but this comes much later, beginning at line 65, and is not connected to the poet's speech, but is connected to moral behavior generally. And then we have at the proemium's conclusion a statement that St. Peter has invited the poem. We don't have an explicit expression of the saint's glory, especially not one that is coupled with the poet's incapacity. We do get in this proemium certain elements that are much harder to map onto the structure as I've articulated it. Reflection upon the soul, upon the need for illumination, for baptism. And as an aside, it's tempting here to connect the emphasis on baptism in this poem with the feast day of St. Peter as it's given in the early Syriac martyrology as December 28th. So potentially kind of preparatory for Epiphany. What I especially want to point out with the Peter poem is just how flexible the proemium can be while still remaining recognizable as a specific form. The third example, continuing to the right, is the Memre on St. Lawrence, which attests all of the 5 characteristics and in the order I've suggested: apostrophe and invocation, poetic weakness compared with Christ's knowledge, identification of the poem as resulting from the saint's invitation, and then an explicit turn to the audience. This proemium is about 47 lines long. So at least according to my, the form as I've defined it, this would be kind of like the perfect example. Finally, the fourth example comes from the Memre on Julian Saba. I include this one especially because of its uniqueness vis-a-vis the other examples. While it evidences 4 of the key characteristics, apostrophe and invocation, the poet's incapacity coupled with an expression of the saint's glory, a statement that the saint has asked for the poem, it includes all of these, but the order of those elements is unique. It begins by identifying the saint's invitation, and then after 10 lines, turns to the section we expect to be at the beginning, the apostrophe and invocation. And then it concludes by expressing the poet's incapacity in the saint's glory. I hope this makes clear that we can think of the proemium as having a clear, fairly reliable structure, as using key elements that define the proemium as a coherent form, recognizable to both poet and audience. But my aim is not only to identify this literary structure, but to connect it back to this question of the vibrancy of the saints that I began with. To do that, I want to turn from the observation of this form to the question of ritual. I want to suggest that what from a literary perspective we can think of as formulaicism, from a religious perspective we can think of as ritual. On one level, connecting the Memre to context of ritual is an obvious move. Insofar as many of these hagiographical poems arose in context of saints' feasts, insofar as so many of these poems arose in context of saints' feasts. Jacob alludes to these feasts and to the relics around which the poems arose in clear ways. On this level, the poems are ritual documents in the sense that they were written as part of the festivals that grew up around the saints. They are part of the ritual fabric of those feasts. But on another level, we can think of the proemia themselves in terms of their language and structure as acting in ritual ways. As scholars of ritual have noted, ritual texts, be they linguistic or oral, proceed in highly stylized, highly idealized ways. Ritual words are not valued for their originality, for their unexpectedness or unique authenticity. Ritual words, in a sense, precede both poet and audience. The poet inhabits ritual words rather than creating them. They are predictable, reliable, familiar. They are the linguistic equivalent of bells that mark a service's beginning. In their regularity, they are triggers for audience, for poet, for God. They mark off the space of the poem as set apart. They invite God and the saints into the poem. They invite the audience to expect a divine hovering. In Jacob's proemia, the predictable structures and the formulaic vocabulary signal the poem as a special kind of place. The poems make no claims to be original speech to register a kind of unique experience. Drawing on these formulaic elements, ritual language does something. The point of a ritual is not to describe some state of being, but to consecrate it, to bring something into being. What is it then that the form of the proemia brings into being? Susan Harvey, in her essay, The Poet's Prayer, has argued that Jacob uses the introductory prayers to establish the Memre as a sacred event. Though the poet's first-person voice looms large in this process, Harvey argues, rightly I think, that the poet in fact engages in a sort of recontextualization of the self. The poet's expression of his own poetic incapacity aims to make space for a variety of other actors: divine presence, speaker, content, and listener. We can join Professor Harvey's reflections to those of Bob Kitchen, who has so cogently named the way in which Jacob presents the literary elements out of which his poetry is born, as exerting a kind of agency on him. Joining these two scholars, I want to ask now, how does this play out in the hagiographical Memre? If Jacob's aim in the proemium is to bring the Memre into being as a sacred event, where do the saints sit in that event? In answering this question, I want to try to connect the first two parts of this paper, the saints as vibrant actors and the proemia as reifications of divine presence. Part 3, agents among agents. Jacob's hagiographical poetry, like all of his poetry, figures itself as brought into being by forces outside of him. While Jacob often reifies and even personifies the non-human forces that act upon him, he less dramatically and quite simply presents his poetic task as one to which he is passive. Like the relics that sought out Abhai, Jacob's own poems and the saints that move inside of them seek him of their own accord. In the proemium to his Memre on Lawrence, for example, Jacob asks that his mind be shaken so as to speak. Addressing Christ, he sings, "May your blood boil up in me so that I might proclaim the sufferings of their persons." Poetic content is here figured as blood, which is both inside and outside of Jacob, spilling from his mouth as poetry. Jacob reaffirms the idea that he is acted upon when he sings, "Concerning the glorious Lawrence, sweet fragrance, and the troop of his companions, I have been shaken, Zoet, today to speak." These expressions are so typical in Jacob that we tend to pass over them, or take them as yet more metaphors in an already highly metaphorical corpus. Yet coupled with all the other ways in which Jacob presents the world outside of himself as vibrant and acting upon him, my sense is that we should take these verbal tendencies as revelatory of his poetic, reflecting his sense that the Memre happens to him. In the hagiographical poetry, Jacob most consistently instrumentalizes himself in relationship to the saint by depicting the poem as arising at the saint's behest. The proemium to the Memre on Peter's conversion of Rome is long and admittedly somewhat rambling. Recognizing this tangential quality, Jacob himself recognizes that he is rambling. Jacob at line 93 humorously chastises himself for wandering around and then indicates that he must come back because the apostle's story has called him. Come here, O mind, why do you roam at such lengths? The beloved story of the apostles or of apostleship begs for you. This then becomes a theme as Jacob turns to his audience and announces, Simon Kepha is the foundation of the Holy Church. He has called me today to speak his story before the hearers. As the bones of the saints act in the world of their own accord, so the saint beckons the poet, whose work arises out of that beckoning. These issues of instrumentality in the saints play out most dramatically in Jacob's Memre on the 40 Martyrs of Sebastia. In this poem, we find alongside the saints the characters of the Memre and the Sharba, whose activities Bob Kitchen has attended to. Lines 1 through 8 of the Memre on the 40 Martyrs profiles as a scene in which Jacob situates himself alongside Christ and the martyrs. This invocatory section concluded in lines 9 and 10, he introduces the Memre and the Sharba into the space of the poem. A wondrous Memre, the story that I have begun, seeks. So I'm taking the Memre de Tehra as the object of Bo A. A wondrous Memre, the story that I have begun, seeks, for I have accepted to depict 40 images for the 40 martyrs. In this twisting couplet, Jacob exposes a number of moving parts into the poem. The Sharba moves first and seeks Jacob, the first person voice, but instrumentally articulated, as a secondary actor. Jacob is at the mercy of the Sharba, which seeks some other kind of Memre, some Memre distinct from the one he is actually singing. The Memre is then, this imaginary Memre, is then a sort of third actor perched between reality and ideal. It is presented as imaginary, it is invoked as imaginary, specifically not the Memre Jacob sings. Nevertheless, it occupies a position independent of the Sharba, the poet, the I, and the poem itself, which the poet is actually singing. Jacob then offers a variation on this theme a few lines later. A skilled scribe, pleasing in the sight of humans, the story that I have begun seeks, and then it can be spoken. Here the Sharba again functions as active agent, but seeks not a Memre, but a skilled scribe, whom Jacob in a self-effacing manner distinguishes from himself. Jacob will go on to describe in a sort of failed ekphrasis the kinds of images this imagined scribe could produce, linguistic images made of fine jewels and ornate structures. But just as in the previous line, Jacob's actual poem emerges out of this conjoining of human and non-human, and in this case, real and imagined actors. The Sharba reveals the saints to Jacob, and as such, acts upon him as a sort of blunt force. Only the story of their beauties have I lifted up in my mind, yet I stand dumbstruck, amazed. All kinds of dizziness has seized me. And you can see in each of these three examples the way the syntax itself upsets the flow of the poetry. The saints, as manifest in their story, move through Jacob's poem like their relics move through the world. They clash against Jacob, rendering him dizzy. It is out of this clashing of agents, among which Jacob remains perched between passivity and demanded agency, that the poem comes. How do we bring together these three things? The vibrancy of the saints, the ritual of the poem, and the agency of saints and others. J.Z. Smith defines ritual as a habit of paying attention. But habits, of course, must be cultivated. And so I would revise this definition and call ritual the cultivation of the habit of paying attention. The proemia in this reading are not mere posturing, not an empty rhetoric of humility, or worse, a bald masking of power, but an attuning of oneself and one's audience to a world of vibrant things. The saints occupy a privileged place in this vibrant ecosystem as unique portents of divine power and presence. They stand not entirely at odds with the world, but not quite a piece of it either. They move through it, uniquely illumined, but in often unsettling ways. Jacob's poetry builds as well as reveals this world of vibrant things, with the saints moving through it. The content of the proemia situate his poetic self in a process of being acted upon by these vibrant things. They well up within him, dizzy him from the outside, make demands of him, pray for him, and summon him. The proemia function as a ritualizing recognition of, a paying attention to, this reality, the reality of the poet's own subjectedness to the vibrancy of the saints. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for this wonderful talk. It's wonderful to hear you speak. A quick question, if I may start the questioning process. It seems like the victory of Christ and now lives on in the saints now who had passed away for one reason or another. Mm-hmm. And it continues in the author himself who's speaking about these saints. Is that a good way to understand what you were presenting?
Yeah, I think that's entirely accurate. And I didn't go into kind of the Christological side of this in a sense because I wanted to really sit with the way in which the saints do indeed act as a kind of freewheeling movement in the world. But theologically, I mean, there's no doubt that Jacob anchors this in Christ's activity in the world. You can see it even in the formula of the proemia, that it sort of situate. There's an order to it. It's Christ and then saint, and he will even say apologetically. I didn't go into this, but for example, the kind of narrative, the parable from Abhai with which I started, when these relics are moving of their own accord, he says, of course, it's God's presence that is moving in them, but it's sort of both and the way he puts it. You know, he'll say it's God's presence, and then the saints go and do all this stuff, apparently by themselves. So I think thinking of it as a kind of enduring presence of Christ in the world makes a lot of sense of how Jacob himself conceives it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I see Anthony Salim. I think you might be muted.
How's that?
That's good, I can hear you.
Thank you, Jeff, for this very good presentation. Jeff, I'm Catholic priest in the Maronite tradition, and my concern is catechetical. How do the terms, especially in the parts of the liturgy, how can they teach us? That's at essence. And I wonder if you would could and would comment on the catechetical aspect. For example, we heard so much from a proemian, but so many other things. But would you be able to comment on that?
Certainly. I mean, I think Jacob's Memre are entirely catechetical, and by focusing on the proemium and thinking of these in terms of ritual, I'm kind of intentionally trying to get us to think about the way in which they're perhaps non-pragmatic, non-discursive, or maybe meta-pragmatic. But from the proemium, he then turns to the narratives of the saints, which tend to be, often either exhortatory in the sense of as the saint endured all these struggles, so you endure these struggles, kind of edifying in that way, or just kind of straightforward storytelling. So there's a catechetical sense in the sense that he wants to distribute these stories through whatever the audiences that he's preaching are. There's not a kind of concrete singular message to the hagiographical poems, but I would say they are catechetical in the sense that he wants people to know the stories of the saints, and he's sees them both as kind of a witness to Christ in the world, and also kind of edifying for people to reflect on their own behavior in light of.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Anthony.
I think I see, I saw Dina. I see two participants have raised their hands, but I can only see Dina Boero. Dr. Boero, I'll call on you first.
Hi, this was a really wonderful talk. I want to thank you for it. And I have a big picture question about your project, which if you're not ready to answer, that's okay. But in the formation of your project, right? Like at the core of your project is that genre and its divisions in the ancient world are powerful, right? And that poetry has a special way of communicating, right? There's lots of literature about the saints that isn't in poetry that you're excerpting, leaving out of your project. And there's a lot of good, like logistical reasons to do that. We all have to limit our projects. But also within that is a belief that we get something special from poetry. And so what do you think that special thing is as someone who has studied poetry for, 15 Syriac poetry for 10 or 15 years now?
I'm not ready to answer that question, Tina. No, that's a great question. I mean, in a sense, that's the $64 million question. I think what I've tried to show in this paper, and what I'm increasingly drawn to, is the way in which poetry cultivates, whether we call it an experiential, I mean, it's difficult to apply that word to the ancient world from a contemporary perspective. I would use the word of ritual or consecratory relationship to the content. So that is a way of saying, I think it's really easy for us, and of course tempting, to focus on all the content in this literature. And I'm trying to think through the way that the content kind of acts upon us. And I think that's what I've lost I can't see you anymore, Dina. Okay, I can't see you, but, oh, there you are. I think that is what literary form in general does. It forces us to contemplate the non-discursive, non-pragmatic aspects of literary works. So that's not a great answer to your question, but I'm trying to not give it, I'm trying to give an answer that makes sense from our perspective, because poetry has certain resonances for contemporary audiences, but is also authentic to Jacob. I mean, there's a sense in which even the way I'm talking about genre is, of course, a construct, like the fact that I'm trying to identify the proemium as this concrete structure. I don't think Jacob thought about it like that. I do think he probably thought about kind of rhetorical building blocks, and that's what I tried to show. So the apostrophe and invocation, the invitation to the saint, the expression of humility. I think he thought of these as kind of building blocks, whether in the style of the progymnosmata he learned them as such, or it was more of an organic thing. I'm not sure, but perhaps that's what I would also say is poetry is a kind of working, right? The process of composition is very, very intentional, and it is for prose too. I mean, this is something people have said to me. Like, it's not like poetry is the only self-consciously literary act in the ancient world. But perhaps I would argue that it's more self-conscious, than it's more attuned than others. And I think, some evidence for this is that when we look historically at how cultures have tried to define literature, they seem to start with poetry. If you want to know what literature is, start with poetry and move out from there. So that's a Jacobian, roaming, rambling answer to your question, which I will ask you to keep asking me that question. Okay, next I see Philip.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff, for your talk. My question's going in a different direction, but actually has to do with Dr. Boero's work as well on Simeon. You mentioned when you were talking about Abhai that it doesn't seem like Jacob knows so much about this particular saint. And he focuses, as you mentioned, on the bones and the story of seeking out the authenticity of them. And this is also something in Simeon's, especially his second Memre on Simeon, where it doesn't seem like Jacob knows so much about this story. And he really focuses on very specific details. I think there's great variation in the biblical homilies as well, where you find some that run through the narrative and run through quite a lot of texts, and others that are more meditative and take a long time. So Jacob's Hexaemera on 150 pages on Genesis 1. Doesn't seem like a lot for a treatise, but perhaps for a homily, maybe it was the setting. And I'm wondering if there's a way in these homilies that Jacob doesn't talk so much about the narrative, but focuses on these individual aspects in which he's trying to make particular aspects of the story present to the readers, much in the same way that he's trying to make the bones present to the readers, perhaps which they know from their local context, but he's making them part, an agent within the narrative of the homily.
Yeah. So on Abhai, I have to admit, Abhai appears to be kind of a thorny textual issue that I haven't totally gotten a handle on. And so we have, I think it's a 15th century manuscript, in which we have preserved a revision that Michael the Syrian did. But there's also a text in a manuscript in the Bodleian that I haven't seen. And then in the martyr Ozael, I think his name is, there's a snippet about this this narrative detail that in the time of Abhai, the relics were tried in fire, that this was a new thing, that relics had to be tested like a martyr had to be tested. My sense is that with Abhai, it's more of a source critical point than it is a literary point. That I could be wrong, but my sense is that he knows the central narrative about Abhai, which is that Abhai comes to Constantinople, has this interaction with Theodosius, and then leaves, and he doesn't know a lot else about him. And presumably on his calendar, he has a feast day of Abhai that he's got to preach about. And so he builds out of kind of his knowledge of aesthetic topoi and basic detail, like Abhai spent some time in the capital, then came to the desert, this quite long developed poem in which there's a very coherent narrative center. And then the rest is more, isn't he great? Didn't he do these wonderful things? And he healed this woman, which may be historical, or maybe just that it's just a kind of a miracle story he grabs to fill out the poem. But that's different from what you're asking, where we have poems where he does know the narrative and he fixates on a detail. And I mean, right now I would say that with the hagiographical poems, it just varies. There are some where he will, in a pretty straightforward way, just recount the narrative that matches up with what we, like the poem on the 40 martyrs matches up pretty well with the prose narrative. I'm trying to think of something like the Memre on Sergius and Bacchus, which is actually mostly just Sergius, does not have a lot of narrative content, but he seems to know the prose narrative. So there it is more of making a didactic function. But right now, if I were to generalize, recognizing that this will exist on YouTube forever and I may regret it immediately, I would say that compared to something like the biblical homilies, where you have this real kind of thoroughgoing, almost theological vision, um, I'm thinking of like the homily on the Tower of Babel, where it's really a concern for him to think through this theological principle. Why did God scatter the nations? The hagiographical poems tend to have less of a thoroughgoing theological agenda and tend to be more piecemeal. Here's a little bit of the narrative. Here's a helpful anecdote, so on and so forth. Does that get at what you're asking?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Okay, I see Susan's hand.
First, thank you very much, Jeff. This has just been a feast of a talk for us. And I'd like to just highlight the importance, I think, that you're granting to the formulaic pieces of these homilies, and think about how important that kind of identification is for what these homilies are doing. And maybe back to our first question, what you've described for the proemia, which of course I just love, those elements, those 5 elements, as stable yet flexible, seems to me like you're almost setting, or not, Jacob is establishing these homilies almost as a liturgy within a liturgy. I mean, if you look at these elements, these 5 elements you've identified, they kind of map onto the order that a liturgy would be performed. And again, where you have stable elements which are flexible. You can add a litany, you can take it out, you can add a hymn, you can take, you can move things around. And I think it's really interesting to think about these homilies that way. I really like your definition of ritual speech, or ritual in this instance, as cultivation of habit of paying attention, because what is Jacob trying to do with his congregation? I think we're really just beginning to really get it at this dynamic and interactive aspect of these texts. And one thing I think is that we think about the different levels of education, we think about what would have been valued or accessible in the ancient world. And if you work with what is familiar to people, people can enter in. So, I think about things like nativity hymns or whatever. The last thing you want is something nobody's ever heard of before. The last thing you want is originality. People can't get it. They can't get into it. And so even thinking about these elements in Jacob's homilies, he doesn't have to do narrative content if people already know the story, or he can engage a story that people have heard many times, and then that's familiar to them and they can come in. I think often in for example, in the homilies he often takes almost exact portions of the dialogue hymns and includes them as dialogues, like in his homilies on Mary. So if you already knew that hymn, I mean, this is a very smart move as a preacher. It's like when you use a familiar Christmas carol for the wording in your homily, or in our classrooms when we invoke, I don't know, whatever songs the students, it's a way of really pulling your audience in, using familiar elements, but you recast them in ways that help the congregation pay attention anew. And this sort of forming of a mini liturgy within a larger liturgy, I think also serves a kind of pedagogical function, a kind of training of the faithful Christian. And so I really hope you'll continue to develop this. I think this is extremely important and a very fresh way for us as scholars to try to get out what, for lack of a better word, the experience of going to liturgy or hearing a sermon was for the congregation. And that, I think, is something that scholarship hasn't yet paid it. We're just beginning to turn to that, and you're helping us do it. So thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate all of that. And yeah, I mean, your essay on the Poet's Prayer was really, really helpful. So thank you for doing that work. Yeah, I mean, what want to think more about it. I really like the thinking about the poemium as itself mirroring kind of liturgical structure. But it occurs to me as I listen to you that I'm probably right now thinking a lot more about Jacob and Jacob's compositional process and Jacob's conception of himself as a poet. And what you emphasize is the role that the audience plays in this, both his awareness of the audience, but the audience is in a sense another one of these agents that are exerting a force on the poetry, because he has to write something that they know. Yeah, so that's something I need to think more about. Thank you for that.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, Jeff, again for this wonderful talk.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks.
But before we adjourn, I'd like to remind you that our next speaker will be Muriel Dubier. She will deliver a paper entitled Jacob of Serug and His Time, Preaching in Late Antique Mesopotamia on Wednesday, April 21st, 2021. For those who are joining us late, I do apologize. We changed the clock in Washington, D.C., and some of you have missed it. So hopefully next time, when I send an email, I will put a link to people to check the time in Washington, D.C. according to, in relation to where they live in the world. An announcement: the Maronite Seminary in Washington, D.C. Is sponsoring 3 talks on John Apameya in April. The guest speaker is Rodrigue Constantine, a recent graduate from the Catholic University of America. For more information, please visit thehiddenpearl.org. And I thank all of you again for joining us. It has been wonderful, and I look forward to the other talks that are coming up throughout the year. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.